They said it was just another winter night on the edge of Lake Superior. But when a battle-worn veteran and his aging military dog heard 3 quiet taps beneath an old tavern floor, they didn't know they were standing at the edge of a secret buried for nearly a century. A secret powerful enough to stop greed, awaken a forgotten community, and change a broken man's life forever. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Duluth, Minnesota sat at the edge of Lake Superior like a working man braced against the wind, shoulders forward, jaw tight, refusing to complain. In January, the city didn't sparkle so much as endure. The lake threw cold at the hillside neighborhoods in long, steady breaths, and the sky stayed the color of dull steel, as if the sun had filed a formal request to be excused. Along the harbor, ice gathered in jagged sheets, and the gulls sounded hoarse, like even they were tired of shouting into the gale. That afternoon, the weather did what it often did here. It turned mean without warning. A band of sleet became hail. Hail became a sharp, rattling drumbeat on roofs and windshields. The air smelled metallic, like snow had teeth. Kellen Ward drove north along the back roads that stitched the city to the forest. His pickup was old enough to have opinions, heater whining, dashboard buzzing faintly, wipers doing their best like 2 exhausted arms. He kept both hands on the wheel, not from anxiety, but from habit. Kellen was 41, broad-shouldered, built with the dense strength of someone who had spent years lifting things that didn't want to be lifted. His hair was cut short, dark with a few streaks of gray that seemed less like aging and more like punctuation. A trimmed beard shadowed his jaw, not styled so much as managed, and his mouth held itself in a line that suggested he didn't waste words on decorative feelings. His eyes were a pale gray-green, the kind that looked calm until you noticed they rarely softened. People had told him he looked steady. He knew what they meant. Steady, like a bridge that had been hit before and didn't intend to fall again. What made him like that wasn't mysterious. It was simply layered. Years ago, he'd been a combat engineer, trained to clear what could kill you. Wires, mines, booby traps, the hidden mathematics of danger. Then he came home and found the world full of quieter explosives. A marriage that cracked under grief. A house that felt too large when the laughter disappeared. A calendar that kept moving like it hadn't noticed anything was missing. In the end, he didn't leave town with a plan. He left with the kind of exhaustion that makes the body drive even when the mind isn't sure where it's going. Beside him sat Sable, a Belgian Malinois with a coat like burnished sand and a face sharpened by intelligence. She was 7, lean and athletic, the sort of dog that seemed to be built out of intent. Her ears stood up like 2 vigilant questions. Her muzzle was dusted darker around the nose, and her amber eyes tracked everything. Tree line, road shoulders, shifting shadows, like she was reading a language only she had learned. Sable had once been military K-9. She still carried herself like it, even off duty. Posture alert, movements economical, attention pinned to the world. A scar ran thin along her left shoulder, half hidden by fur, a pale seam from a shrapnel cut that had healed clean but never let her forget. She didn't bark for fun. She didn't whine for sympathy. When she wanted to tell Kellen something, she used the signal they'd invented after too many nights in places where noise got people killed. 3 taps. She tapped her paw against the metal floorboard near his boot. Tap, 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 measured and deliberate, not frantic. Kellen's grip tightened on the wheel. He didn't look at her right away because he'd learned to trust her without needing to prove it with his eyes. "What is it?" he asked, voice low, like they were still in a world where sound mattered. Sable's head turned toward the forest, nose lifting. The hail thinned, replaced by wind that sounded like someone dragging a rough sleeve across glass. At first, Kellen heard nothing but weather. Then, threaded through it, came something else. A faint human cry, not loud, not dramatic, just a strained cracking sound, as if the person making it had already decided nobody would answer. Kellen eased the truck onto the shoulder. Gravel popped beneath the tires. He killed the engine. The sudden quiet was so complete it made the cry easier to hear and worse to ignore. Sable gave a short, urgent huff and tapped once more, softer this time, like punctuation. Kellen grabbed his coat, a rope coil, and a first aid kit from behind the seat. He moved with the same practiced economy he used on job sites. No extra gestures, no wasted motion. Sable jumped down and trotted ahead, her paws sure on the slick ground. The forest began only a few steps beyond the roadside. Birch and pine tangled close together, their trunks striped and dark, the underbrush brittle with cold. The wind here didn't wander. It hunted. The cry came again, closer. Kellen followed Sable downhill through a narrow break in the trees. The slope was steep, glazed with ice, and he had to plant his boots carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. Sable moved like she belonged to gravity. She paused only to check back, ensuring he kept up. Then the ground dropped away into a half-collapsed pit. It looked like an old hunter's trap, one of those cruel, forgotten holes people used decades ago before the world had decided certain kinds of suffering weren't entertainment. Leaves and snow had disguised the rim. Kellen stepped to the edge and peered down. An old man lay at the bottom, half-propped against the dirt wall, breathing in short, angry bursts. He was small, but not delicate, more like a knot of old roots that refused to rot. His hair was white and wet, plastered to his forehead. His face was deeply lined, weathered the way shoreline stone is weathered by ice and water, patient damage. His eyes were a startling blue, still sharp despite pain, and his hands, gnarled, stained by work, clutched at the dirt as if he might climb out by stubbornness alone. One leg was twisted at an angle that made Kellen's stomach tighten with professional recognition. That wasn't a bruise. That was broken. Sable stood beside Kellen at the rim and stared down, silent, ears forward. The old man's gaze flicked to the dog, then to Kellen. "Don't just stand there," he rasped. Even injured, he sounded like someone who had given orders his whole life and expected them to be obeyed. I slipped, like an idiot. Kellen crouched, studying the edges, the stability of the dirt. "Don't move your leg," he said. His voice was calm, not gentle, but steady in a way that made people trust it. "Tell me your name." The old man swallowed and winced as he shifted his weight. "Otis Halberg." He said it like it mattered. Like names were anchors. "I've got a place by the water, the Juniper Lantern Inn. If you've ever driven the Lakeshore Road, you've seen it, or you've seen what's left of it." Kellen didn't respond with the polite noises people make when they're nervous. He planted the rope around a birch trunk, tested it twice, and clipped a carabiner through a loop he'd tied with hands that still remembered urgency. "I'm coming down," he said. The descent was careful. Dirt crumbled under his boots. Cold seeped through his gloves. The old man's breath came loud in the enclosed space, and the smell down here was damp earth and iron. Up above, Sable remained at the rim, watching every movement, her body a taut line. When Kellen reached Otis, he spoke in the same tone he used when clearing rubble. Precise, efficient, making the next step feel possible. "I'm going to loop this under your arms. We're not using that leg. Not if you understand." Otis's eyes narrowed. Annoyance, pride, fear, all braided together. Then he nodded once. Kellen got the rope placed, tightened it, and called up, "Sable." It wasn't a command barked for show, it was a signal. Sable leaned in, teeth closing on the rope above the rim, bracing herself, adding tension like a second anchor. Otis noticed. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Well," he muttered, "that's a serious dog." "She saved my life," Kellen said simply. He didn't add that he'd done the same for her. Some truths didn't need ceremony. With a coordinated pull, Kellen lifting from below, Sable and the rope doing their work above, they began to raise Otis. The old man hissed through clenched teeth, but he didn't scream. Pride could be a painkiller, too. Inch by inch, they hauled him up until Kellen could push from behind and guide him over the lip. Sable stepped back at the last second, giving space, then pressed her nose briefly against Otis's boot, as if checking he was real. Otis lay on the ground, chest heaving. Snow and leaves clung to his coat. He stared up at the gray sky like it had personally offended him. Then he let out a dry laugh that turned into a cough. "You pull a man out of the earth," he wheezed, "and the earth gets jealous." Kellen finally allowed a small exhale. Not relief, he didn't trust relief, but the loosening of a knot. "Can you point me to your vehicle?" he asked. Otis's gaze shifted toward the trees. No vehicle, he admitted. I walked. Stubborn habit. Kellen looked at the old man's twisted leg, then back to his own truck parked up the road. The wind snapped through the branches and hail began again, lighter this time but persistent. Somewhere beyond the trees, Lake Superior groaned, the sound low and ancient, like a god shifting in its sleep. All right, Kellen said. We're going to my truck. Then you show me where this inn is. Otis's blue eyes held his for a long moment. The old man's expression softened just slightly, as if the world had offered him something he hadn't expected. Fine, he said. But listen, son. Places like mine, they don't just sit there. They watch. They remember. Sable tapped the ground once, soft, single, like she agreed. Kellen didn't ask what that meant. He only bent down, slid an arm beneath Otis's shoulders, and began the slow work of carrying him toward the road, while the city behind them disappeared into weather and the forest ahead seemed to draw nearer, as if it had been waiting for their footsteps all along. The truck climbed the narrow lakeshore road at a patient crawl, its headlights carving pale tunnels through sleet and drifting snow. Kellen kept one hand steady on the wheel, while the other rested lightly on the gear shift, feeling the vibration of the engine the way some people felt a pulse. Otis Halberg lay reclined across the back seat, bundled in Kellen's spare coat and a wool blanket that smelled faintly of oil and pine sap. Every breath the old man took sounded like it had to negotiate its way through pain first, but he refused to complain. He only stared out the side window as if he were counting memories in the dark. Sable rode up front now, sitting tall, shoulders squared, her amber eyes fixed on the road ahead. Snow clung to the fur along her legs, melting into small dark commas on the floor mat. She seemed calmer than before, but not relaxed. Whatever she had heard in the forest had not been resolved. It had merely changed location. They reached the turnoff just as the sleet softened into a wet, needling snow. The sign was old, hand-painted wood with peeling letters that read, Juniper Lantern Inn, the words nearly swallowed by years of weather. A small metal lantern hung beneath it, unlit, swaying slightly in the wind. Kellen slowed, feeling an odd resistance in his chest, the kind that came when a place announced itself before you were ready to listen. The inn sat back from the road, close enough to Lake Superior that the water's breath could be felt even through the trees. It was a two-story structure built of darkened timber, raised slightly on stone footings, its roof sagging just enough to suggest age without apology. Juniper bushes clustered around the foundation, their sharp, clean scent cutting through the cold. Snow had gathered in uneven drifts along the porch steps, and the windows reflected nothing but gray sky and moving branches. Otis stirred. Still standing, he murmured with something like relief. Stubborn as the people who built it. Kellen parked as close to the porch as he could manage. The wind off the lake pushed at the truck as if testing it. He stepped out, boots crunching, and went around to help Otis. Up close, the old man looked even smaller than he had in the pit, but there was nothing fragile about him. His beard was white and coarse, trimmed short but uneven, as though he cut it himself with little patience for symmetry. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, carved there by years of sun, cold, and the habit of not backing down from arguments. When Kellen slid an arm under his shoulders, Otis gripped his sleeve with surprising strength. Inside the inn, the door resisted at first, then opened with a long, low creak that sounded less like neglect and more like acknowledgement. The air was cool but not dead. It smelled of old wood, juniper, faint smoke, and something sweeter beneath it, spilled liquor that had soaked into the floorboards decades ago and decided to stay. Kellen flicked on the lights. They came up slowly, buzzing, revealing a long room with a bar to the left and a scattering of wooden tables aligned with quiet intention. Nothing felt abandoned. Dust lay evenly, like a deliberate layer rather than chaos. Chairs were pushed in. Glassware behind the bar was clean, if dull with age. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth cold but orderly. Photographs hung above it, black and white images of fishermen, families, and a younger Otis standing beside the same lantern from the sign, his smile wide and unguarded. Sable padded inside last. Her nails clicked softly against the floor as she moved through the space, nose low, reading the room the way she read terrain. She stopped near the fireplace, tilted her head, and placed one paw on the floor. She did not tap. She pressed, as if listening through bone and wood. "Easy," Kellen said, setting Otis carefully into a chair near the bar. He wrapped the blanket tighter around the old man's shoulders and knelt to inspect the injured leg. Swelling had already begun, ugly and undeniable. "We'll stabilize it tonight," he said. "I'll get you to a doctor in the morning." Otis waved a dismissive hand. "Doctors are fine," he said, "but this place doesn't like being empty overnight." His eyes drifted toward the far end of the room. "It behaves better when someone's awake." Kellen didn't comment. He had learned that arguing with people in pain rarely produced truth. Instead, he unpacked the first aid kit, working methodically. Sable lay down nearby, head on her paws, watching his hands. While Kellen worked, another door opened, this one from the back of the inn, and a woman stepped through, stopping short when she saw them. She was tall and spare, maybe late 30s, with a posture that suggested she'd learned to balance weight without leaning on anyone. Her hair was a deep auburn, pulled back into a low knot that had begun to loosen, a few strands escaping to frame a face marked by fine lines at the eyes. Her skin was pale but weathered, the kind that burned in summer and cracked in winter. She wore a thick sweater, jeans, and work boots dusted with flour or sawdust. It was hard to tell which. Otis looked up. "Rowan," he said, his voice softening. "You're still here." Rowan Pike crossed the room in long strides, her gaze taking in Kellen first, assessing, cautious, then Sable, where it lingered with open appreciation. "You're bleeding," she said to Otis, crouching beside him. Her hands were steady, practiced. "Again." "Minor inconvenience," Otis replied. "This is Kellen Ward. He found me before the forest decided I'd had enough." Rowan stood and offered Kellen her hand. Her grip was firm, dry, and direct. "Thank you," she said. There was no tremor in her voice. But something guarded sat behind her eyes. Grief, Kellen recognized, the kind that didn't make noise anymore. "I manage what's left of the place when Otis lets me." "Someone has to make sure it doesn't fall into the lake," Otis said, "or into worse hands." Rowan's mouth tightened at that, but she didn't comment. Instead, she glanced at the leg. "I'll put the kettle on," she said. "Shock's quieter when there's something warm." She moved into the kitchen with the confidence of someone who knew every creak and loose board. Kellen finished the temporary splint, wrapping it securely. Otis grunted but nodded approval. The kettle began to whistle. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows. Sable lifted her head, ears pricked, and turned toward the sound of the lake. A deep groan rolled through the air, ice shifting far offshore. Rowan returned with mugs and set one into Kellen's hands without asking how he took it. Tea, strong and plain. "You look like you fix things," she said, almost casually. "Not just machines." Kellen took a sip. It burned in a way he welcomed. "Depends on what's broken." Rowan glanced around the room, at the photos, the fireplace, the lantern reflected faintly in the window. "This place," she said. "It's been breaking for a long time." Sable stood then and walked toward the bar, stopping near a section of floor where the boards dipped slightly. She lowered her head, sniffed, and looked back at Kellen. Her tail was still. Kellen felt it again, that quiet resistance in his chest. He followed her gaze, studying the floor. There was nothing obvious, no sound, no movement. Still, the air felt held. Otis watched them both, his blue eyes sharp despite fatigue. "She hears it too," he said quietly. "Good. That means it hasn't given up yet." Kellen straightened. "What hasn't?" Otis leaned back, exhaustion finally catching him. "The inn," he said. "It remembers who's worth keeping." The kettle clicked off in the kitchen. Snow continued to tap against the windows, softer now, as if the storm were losing interest. Sable placed her paw gently on the floor again, not tapping, just touching, and then lay down beside Otis's chair, her body a warm, solid presence. Kellen stood there, tea cooling in his hands, and realized that whatever road he'd meant to take beyond Duluth had narrowed without asking him. The Juniper Lantern Inn was no longer just a place he had arrived at. It was a place that had noticed him. And for reasons he couldn't yet name, that felt less like a warning than a beginning. Night settled over Lake Superior, with a weight that felt intentional. The wind eased, but the quiet that replaced it was not gentle. It pressed against the inn like a held breath. Inside the Juniper Lantern Inn, the lights hummed softly, and the old wood responded to temperature changes with small, patient sounds, ticks and sighs, as if the building were speaking in its sleep. Kellen sat at the bar with his coat still on, fingers wrapped around a mug that had long since stopped steaming. Rowan moved through the room with practiced economy, closing curtains, checking the latch on the back door, aligning chairs that didn't strictly need alignment. Otis had drifted into a shallow doze in his chair, his chin tipped forward, one hand resting on the armrest as if he were holding the inn in place by touch alone. Sable lay near the fireplace, her body parallel to the hearth, nose resting on her paws. She did not sleep. Her eyes followed shadows as they shifted along the stonework. The firebox was cold, but something about that spot held her attention the way a distant whistle holds a trained dog's ears, faint, persistent, impossible to ignore. Rowan broke the silence first. "I'll set up the spare room," she said, not asking whether Kellen planned to stay. Her voice was even, but her shoulders carried the subtle tension of someone unused to relying on strangers. "Otis shouldn't be moved again tonight." Kellen nodded. "I'll take the couch," he said. It felt easier than admitting he didn't want to leave yet. "I'll keep an ear out." Rowan studied him for a moment, then inclined her head. "This place rewards people who listen," she said. "It's not always kind about it." She disappeared up the stairs, her steps light but sure. Kellen glanced at the photographs again, the fishermen, the winter picnics, the lantern held aloft like a promise. He felt a strange pull toward the hearth, toward the section of floor Sable had examined earlier. The boards there dipped slightly, a subtle sag that could be blamed on age or damp. Still, his eyes kept returning to it. He rose and crossed the room, crouching near the fireplace. He pressed his palm flat against the floor. The wood was cool, but beneath that coolness, he sensed something else. A faint vibration, more imagined than real. He leaned closer, ear hovering inches above the boards. For a long moment, there was nothing but the hum of the lights and Otis's steady breathing. Then it came. Knock, 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 not loud. Not forceful. 3 measured taps from somewhere below the floor, as if someone were answering a question Kellen hadn't realized he'd asked. Sable's head snapped up. Her ears went forward, rigid. She rose to her feet without a sound, and placed her paw on the exact spot where Kellen knelt. Rowan appeared at the foot of the stairs, eyes sharp. "You heard that," she said. Kellen looked up. "Yes." Otis stirred, blinking awake. He did not look surprised. "It's been a while," he murmured. "I wondered if it would try again." Rowan's jaw tightened. "Otis," she said carefully, "you said the noises were just the pipes." "They were," Otis replied, "until they weren't." Kellen straightened slowly. "What's under here?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Otis exhaled through his nose. "History," he said, "and trouble, if it's found by the wrong hands." Rowan crossed the room and knelt beside Kellen, her fingers brushing the edge of the hearth. "You never told me," she said to Otis. There was no accusation in her tone, only a tired acceptance that people carried secrets the way they carried old injuries. Otis closed his eyes. "I told your husband," he said softly. He understood what it meant to keep something quiet. The mention landed like a dropped plate. Rowan's hand stilled. She stood abruptly and turned away, pressing her palm to the bar until her breathing steadied. Kellen watched her with the careful distance of someone who recognized grief as a private geography. A knock came again, 3 taps, slower this time, as if whatever lay beneath the floor were waiting to see if it still had an audience. Sable lowered her head and let out a low, controlled growl that never rose to a bark. Kellen weighed the moment. In his working life, you didn't open sealed things at night unless you had to, but you also didn't ignore warnings. He stood. "We don't open anything tonight," he said, "not without light, not without a plan." Otis nodded. "Tomorrow then," he agreed. "Daylight makes honest witnesses." Rowan swallowed and gave a small nod of her own. "Tomorrow." The night passed in fragments. Kellen dozed on the couch, waking whenever the inn shifted or the wind nudged the eaves. Once he thought he heard movement below the floorboards, not knocking, just the soft suggestion of presence. But when he sat up, The sound was gone. Sable remained awake, repositioning herself twice, always keeping the hearth in her line of sight. Morning arrived pale and thin. Sunlight crept through the curtains, revealing dust motes suspended like tiny constellations. The lake beyond the windows was steel blue and deceptively calm. Rowan was already in the kitchen, moving quietly, her hair loose now, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She poured coffee without ceremony and set a mug beside Kellen's elbow. Otis woke stiff and irritable, which Rowan took as a good sign. "Pain means you're still here," she told him, adjusting his blanket. He grunted agreement. By mid-morning, a visitor arrived, a man in his late 50s with a beard that had gone mostly gray but refused to surrender completely. He wore a canvas jacket stained with fish oil and carried himself with the stooped confidence of someone who had spent decades leaning into wind. "Name's Eli Boone," he said, removing his cap as he stepped inside. His eyes flicked to Otis, then to Kellen. "Rowan called. Said you pulled Otis out of a bad spot." Eli's handshake was rough but respectful. "Lake's been in a mood," he added. "Takes more than it gives this time of year." He stayed only long enough to drop off fresh bread and check Otis's leg, offering practical advice without sentiment. Before he left, he glanced at the hearth and frowned slightly. "You hear anything odd last night?" he asked Rowan. Rowan hesitated, then shook her head. "Just the house settling." Eli studied her face for a beat longer than necessary, then nodded and left without pressing. Kellen noticed. Some towns ran on silence as much as speech. After Eli's departure, Kellen fetched a pry bar and a flashlight from his truck. He did not bring them inside right away. Instead, he stood on the porch, looking out over the lake. The horizon was clean and unforgiving. Whatever waited beneath the floor had waited a long time. Another hour wouldn't change its patience. Inside, Sable had returned to the hearth. She tapped once, light, precise, and looked at Kellen. Not insistence, invitation. "All right," he said quietly. "Just a look." They moved the hearthrug aside, revealing darker boards beneath, worn smooth by decades of boots. One nail sat proud of the wood, rusted and slightly bent. Kellen knelt and pressed gently. The board shifted, just enough to let out a breath of air that smelled faintly of cedar and something older, metal and oil. Rowan sucked in a breath. "That's not just a crawl space," she said. Otis watched, eyes bright despite fatigue. "My father sealed it," he said. "Said some doors didn't belong to their owners." Kellen straightened, the pry bar resting idle in his hand. He met Rowan's gaze, then Otis's. "We stop here," he said. "We don't open it today." Rowan blinked. "Why not?" "Because someone else might be listening," Kellen replied. He glanced toward the windows, toward the road beyond the trees. "And because once we open it, we don't get to pretend we didn't." Silence settled again, heavier now, but purposeful. Sable lay down, satisfied for the moment, her chin resting on her paws. Beneath the floor, there was no knock this time, only a sense, faint but unmistakable, that whatever waited there had been acknowledged. That was enough for one morning. The weather changed its mind by afternoon. The sky over Lake Superior thinned from iron gray to a washed, uncertain blue, and sunlight began to slip between clouds in narrow bands that looked almost apologetic. Snow melted along the porch steps of the Juniper Lantern Inn, leaving dark, wet outlines where boots had passed earlier. Kellen stood outside with his jacket unzipped, replacing a loose board near the railing. He worked slowly, deliberately, as if testing whether the place would object to being touched. Sable sat a few feet away, 7 years old and still built like a question mark pulled taut. Her coat caught the light in muted gold and rust tones, her ribs barely visible beneath muscle shaped by years of disciplined movement. She watched the tree line, not the lake, ears flicking now and then. Tracking sounds too ordinary for Kellen to notice, wind through needles, ice shifting far out on the water, a distant engine that hadn't yet earned suspicion. Inside, Rowan moved between kitchen and bar, inventorying supplies with a pencil tucked behind her ear. In daylight, she looked younger than she had the night before, though the lines at the corners of her eyes were more visible now, etched there by years of smiling through fatigue. She wore a flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, forearms lean and marked by small scars, burns, cuts, the incidental punctuation of a working life. Otis sat near the window, leg elevated, gaze fixed on the lake. He hadn't spoken much since morning, but he seemed alert in a way that felt purposeful, like someone waiting for a scheduled arrival. That arrival announced itself with the crunch of tires on gravel. Sable was on her feet before the engine cut. She did not bark. She stepped forward, placing herself squarely between the porch and the drive, body still, tail low, eyes locked. Kellen straightened, resting his hammer on the railing, and followed her gaze. The vehicle was a black SUV, clean enough to look wrong in winter. It stopped just short of the porch. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out who looked as though he'd been assembled from confidence and expense. He was in his mid-50s, tall, broad through the shoulders, his posture relaxed but practiced. His hair was dark, with silver threaded at the temples, slicked back neatly despite the damp. A trimmed beard framed a mouth that smiled easily, too easily, the way salesmen smiled when they believed in leverage. His coat was wool, tailored, the kind that didn't expect to meet mud. He took in the inn with an expression of polite interest, eyes cataloging details, roofline, foundation, proximity to water, before settling on Kellen. "Afternoon," he said, voice warm, controlled. "I hope I'm not intruding." Rowan stepped onto the porch beside Kellen, wiping her hands on a towel. "Depends," she said evenly, "on who you are." The man smiled wider. "Hollis Crane," he said, offering his hand first to Rowan, then to Kellen when she did not take it. His grip was firm but impersonal, like a contract. "I represent Blue Silt Renewables. We're conducting preliminary assessments along the lakeshore." Otis pushed himself up slightly in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Assessments," he repeated. "That's a new word for trespassing." Hollis chuckled as if indulging a harmless joke. "Only with permission," he said, "which is what I'm here to discuss." Sable took one step forward. Hollis glanced down at her, a flicker of calculation crossing his face. "Beautiful dog," he said. "Military?" "Yes," Kellen replied, short and final. Hollis nodded. "Figures. Discipline recognizes discipline." He turned back to Rowan and Otis. "The county's exploring options for sustainable energy expansion, clean power, jobs, infrastructure. This stretch of land," he gestured vaguely toward the lake, "is uniquely positioned." Rowan crossed her arms. "This is a tavern," she said, "not a turbine." "Today," Hollis agreed, "but markets change, communities grow." His gaze returned to Kellen. "You look like someone who understands improvement." Kellen met his eyes. "I understand repair," he said. "Those aren't the same thing." For a moment, Hollis's smile tightened, then smoothed itself again. "Fair," he said. "Let's speak plainly." He reached into his coat and withdrew a slim folder, white and pristine. "Blue Silt is prepared to make an offer, generous, enough to relocate this establishment farther inland, refurbish it properly, preserve its character." Otis laughed, sharp and humorless. "You can't relocate a shoreline," he said, "and you can't refurbish memory." Hollis sighed, as though disappointed by a child's stubbornness. "Sentiment doesn't hold up in zoning hearings," he said. "Paper does." At that, something shifted, not in the room, but in the air. Sable's ears flattened slightly. She turned her head, not toward Hollis, but toward the road beyond him. Kellen noticed and followed her line of sight, just as a second vehicle slowed at the edge of the drive and continued on without stopping. A survey truck, county issued, watching. Rowan spoke, her voice calm but edged now. "You should go." Hollis regarded her for a long beat, then nodded. "Of course," he said. He placed the folder on the porch rail. "Take some time. Think it over." His eyes flicked to Kellen once more. "Progress has a way of arriving whether people invite it or not." He turned and walked back to the SUV. As it pulled away, Sable released a low growl that never quite reached sound. Inside, the inn felt different, not violated, alerted. Otis closed his eyes. "That's sooner than I expected," he murmured. Rowan picked up the folder but did not open it. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes," Otis replied, "and not politely." Kellen looked from the door to the hearth, then down at Sable, who had returned to her spot near the sagging floorboards. She placed her paw there once. No knock followed. "They're testing boundaries," Kellen said, "seeing who flinches." Rowan exhaled slowly. "Then they won't like the answer." Late afternoon brought another visitor, quieter but no less significant. A woman in her mid-30s approached on foot from the road, her boots scuffed, her coat practical. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight, exposing high cheekbones and a face shaped by restraint rather than softness. Her eyes were sharp, observant, the kind that missed little and forgave less. A badge glinted briefly as she stepped inside. "Sheriff Maris Greywolf," she said, voice even. "I heard Blue Silt stop by." Otis nodded. "They're getting bold." Maris's gaze traveled the room, pausing at the hearth, the photographs, Sable. "They usually do," she said, "before they make a mistake." She spoke with the measured cadence of someone who had learned the cost of rushing judgment. Years ago, a flood had taken her brother during a volunteer rescue, and since then, Maris trusted patterns more than promises. She leaned against the bar, arms folded. "If they pressure you, document everything," she said, "and don't sign a thing." Rowan nodded. "We won't." Maris turned to Kellen. "You staying on?" Kellen hesitated, then answered honestly, "For now." Maris studied him, then inclined her head once. "Good," she said. "Places like this need witnesses." When she left, dusk was settling, turning the lake the color of old coins. Inside, Rowan lit a lamp behind the bar. The lantern's glow reflected in the window, doubled, as if the inn were watching itself. Sable rose and tapped the floor, 3 times, soft but certain. Otis looked up, his blue eyes bright. "It knows," he said. Rowan swallowed. "What does?" Otis smiled faintly. "That it's time." Kellen did not answer. He only placed a hand on the back of Sable's neck, feeling the steady heat of her. Outside, the lake shifted, ice whispering against itself. The offer sat unopened on the rail, white against dark wood, waiting to be refused. The fire came just after midnight, the hour when most honest people were asleep and most dishonest things felt brave enough to move. Kellen was awake on the couch, boots off but not far, one arm thrown over his eyes as if darkness itself were too bright. The inn had settled into a cautious stillness after Hollis Crane's visit, like an animal pretending to sleep while listening for the snap of a twig. Outside, the lake had gone nearly silent, its surface locked under thin ice that whispered only when the wind leaned close. Sable lifted her head first. She did not growl. She did not tap. She rose in a single fluid motion and moved toward the back of the room, nose high, ears angling toward the service corridor that led to the rear exit. Kellen followed the shift in air before he followed her, an acrid tang that did not belong to wood, juniper or age, gasoline. He swung his legs off the couch and crossed the room barefoot, careful to keep his weight light. The smell was faint but unmistakable, threaded beneath the more familiar scents of the inn. Rowan appeared from the stairwell, hair loose, eyes already sharp. She had slept in her clothes, a habit born from years of expecting interruption. "You smell it," she said, not a question. "Yes." Otis's voice drifted from his chair near the window, thin but alert. "They're early," he said. "Cowards always are." Sable stopped short near the back door, her body rigid. She lowered her head and sniffed along the baseboard, then looked back at Kellen. 1 tap. Pause. 2 taps. Not the familiar 3. A warning adjusted for urgency. Kellen nodded once. He moved past her, eased the door open a few inches, and let the cold night air cut through the smell. Outside, the dark was thick and close. Snow crunched softly somewhere beyond the junipers, not footsteps exactly, more like someone shifting weight, deciding whether to commit. Kellen closed the door without sound. "Someone's been here," he said. "Recently." Rowan grabbed a flashlight from behind the bar, her hand steady but her jaw set. "Call Maris," she said. "Now." Kellen had already pulled his phone from his pocket. As it rang, Sable's growl deepened, vibrating through the floorboards. She moved toward the hearth instead of the door, nose sweeping low. She stopped at the same spot where the boards dipped and pawed sharply, once, twice, 3 times. This time, the taps were not communication. They were insistence. The smell was stronger here. Rowan knelt, sweeping the beam of the flashlight across the floor. The light caught on something dark and wet near the edge of the rug. Fabric, soaked through, glistening. Kellen crouched and recognized it immediately. A strip of cloth, charred at one end, reeking of fuel. "A wick," he said. They were going to burn it. Otis closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were bright with something like anger, sharpened by age. "That's how they do it," he said. "When paper doesn't scare you, they try fire." Sable whined once, low and frustrated, then turned toward the small window near the back hall. She pressed her nose to the glass, breathing fog onto it, and let out a sharp bark, short, directional. Kellen followed her gaze and caught a flicker of movement at the tree line, a shadow pulling back, retreating into snow and dark. Maris answered on the second ring. Kellen spoke quietly, relaying only what mattered. She promised to be there within minutes. They found the rest quickly. Behind the stacked firewood near the hearth, tucked just out of sight, was a glass bottle half filled with gasoline, its neck stuffed with another strip of cloth. The stopper had been loosened, ready. Whoever had done this had not been subtle. They had been interrupted or had lost their nerve. Rowan sat back on her heels, the flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. "If you hadn't been awake," Kellen shook his head. "They wanted you to find it," he said. "Fear works better when it announces itself." Maris arrived with the sound of tires on gravel and a flash of blue light that painted the inn's walls in brief, cold strokes. She stepped inside with her coat open. Hand near her radio, eyes already taking inventory. The bottle, the wick, the smell. She exhaled slowly. "This escalated," she said, "and that means they're running out of patience." She photographed everything, bagged the bottle, and crouched to examine the cloth. "Industrial fuel," she added. "Not something you pick up at the corner store." Otis snorted. "Blue silt," he said. "They think clean energy excuses dirty hands?" Maris didn't contradict him. She straightened and looked at Kellen. "I'll have patrols pass through," she said, "but that won't stop paperwork pressure." Rowan's shoulders squared. "Let them come," she said. "We're not leaving." Maris hesitated, then nodded. "Good," she said, "because if this goes where I think it's going, you'll need witnesses." After she left, the inn felt altered, as if something fragile had been tested and decided to hold. No one went back to sleep. Rowan made coffee. Otis watched the windows. Kellen sat on the floor with Sable, one hand resting between her shoulders, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. By morning, the news had moved faster than the frost. A mechanic arrived first, a stocky man named Paul Jensen, with oil permanently embedded in the lines of his hands. He brought boards and a toolbox without asking where to put them. "Heard someone tried to scare you," he said. "Didn't work." A schoolteacher followed with thermoses of soup. Then Eli Boone returned, jaw tight, carrying fresh firewood and a look that suggested he had opinions he was saving for later. By midday, the porch was crowded with neighbors, some loud, some quiet, all purposeful. The inn filled with the sound of work, hammers ringing, voices overlapping, laughter breaking through tension like light through cloud. Sable moved among them, tail low but wagging, accepting scratches with patient dignity before returning to her watch near the hearth. She paused once beside a young boy no older than 10, his hat too big, his eyes curious. He reached for her ear, then stopped, unsure. Sable lowered her head to his level and let him touch her gently. The boy smiled, a small, brave thing. Rowan stood at the bar watching the room transform. Her eyes shone, not with relief, but with recognition. "They won't understand this," she said to Kellen quietly. "People showing up without being paid." Kellen nodded. "They never do." That afternoon, as repairs continued, Sable returned to the hearth and tapped again, 3 slow, measured knocks. Kellen joined her, crouching to press his palm to the floor. The vibration was faint but present, like a heartbeat heard through walls. Otis watched them from his chair, his voice soft. "It's not asking anymore," he said. "It's reminding." Kellen looked at the gathered people, at Rowan's set shoulders, at the sunlight warming the worn floorboards. He understood then that the fire had not failed. It had chosen the wrong direction. Whatever lay beneath the Juniper Lantern Inn had waded through decades of neglect and silence. Now, with threats pressing from above and below, it was making itself known, not to frighten, but to insist on being protected. And for the first time since he'd left Duluth without a plan, Kellen felt the weight of a choice settling into place, solid and undeniable as the stone beneath the hearth. Morning arrived with a kind of restrained grace, the sort that followed violence without erasing it. Smoke still lingered faintly in the grain of the Juniper Lantern Inn, not enough to sting the eyes, but enough to remind everyone how close the night had come to taking something irreplaceable. Sunlight poured through the front windows in long, slanted ribbons, illuminating sawdust, footprints, and half-finished repairs. The inn no longer felt like a target. It felt like a line that had been drawn. Kellen stood near the hearth with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, forearms streaked with grime and ash. He was replacing a scorched section of trim with careful precision, measuring twice, cutting once, the way he had learned to do after watching too many structures fail because someone rushed. His face was calm, but his jaw stayed set, as if he were holding back words meant for someone not present. Sable lay nearby, her body stretched long against the cool stone, eyes half closed but never fully resting. She had not left the hearth since dawn. Rowan moved through the room with a ledger tucked under one arm, taking stock of donations and materials left overnight. Her auburn hair was braided now, tight and practical, keeping it from falling into her face as she worked. There was a steadiness to her movements that had not been there days earlier. Not ease, but resolve. She paused occasionally to thank people, touching an arm, meeting an eye, grounding gratitude in something physical. Otis watched it all from his chair, his injured leg propped higher than before, a cane resting across his lap. The night's attempt on the inn had not frightened him so much as it had clarified something. His face looked sharper this morning, his blue eyes alert, almost eager. He had lived long enough to recognize turning points. By late morning, when the flow of helpers slowed and the inn settled into a quieter rhythm, Otis cleared his throat. It was not loud, but it carried. "It's time," he said. Rowan stopped mid-step. Kellen straightened. Even Sable lifted her head fully now, ears forward. "You said daylight," Rowan replied carefully. "And witnesses," Otis nodded. "We have both." He gestured toward the hearth. The floor there had been partially exposed during repairs, the sagging boards now obvious, their edges darker with age. The smell from below, cedar, oil, old metal, was clearer in the warmth of day. Kellen wiped his hands on a rag and knelt, examining the loosened board. "Once we open this," he said, "there's no sealing it back up without changing what it is." Otis smiled faintly. "That's the point," Rowan exhaled, then nodded. "Do it," she said. But slow. Kellen slid the pry bar under the edge and applied gentle pressure. The board resisted, then lifted with a low, complaining creak. Beneath it was not dirt, as he had expected, but a narrow wooden hatch, reinforced with iron brackets darkened by time. At its center sat a simple latch, worn smooth by hands that had used it often, then not at all. Sable rose and stepped forward, placing her paw against the hatch. She did not tap. She pressed and held, as if anchoring the moment. Otis leaned forward, his cane forgotten. "My father built it," he said quietly. "During the years when men hid barrels and hope in the same places. But that wasn't all it was for." Kellen released the latch. The hatch opened on hinges that sighed like something relieved. Cool air rushed up, dry and clean despite its age, carrying the unmistakable scent of preserved wood and old spirits. Beneath the floor, a short staircase descended into half-darkness. Rowan switched on the flashlight and handed it to Kellen. "I'll come," she said. "No," Otis replied firmly. "You stay here." His gaze shifted to Kellen. "You go first, and the dog." Sable was already halfway down the steps, moving with careful confidence. Kellen followed, the beam of light sweeping across narrow walls lined with pine planks sealed in clay. This was no crude hiding place. Whoever had built it had known exactly how to keep moisture and time at bay. The cellar opened into a small chamber no larger than a living room. Shelves lined the walls, holding dusty bottles, their labels yellowed but intact. Wooden barrels sat sealed with wax. At the far end stood a heavy iron chest, its surface etched with faint symbols and letters nearly worn away. Rowan's voice drifted down from above. "What do you see?" "Care," Kellen replied. "Someone cared enough to make this last." He approached the chest, brushing away dust. The markings resolved into initials, JLC. Sable sniffed the base of the wall beside it, tail stiff. She pawed once at a discolored section of plank, hollow. Kellen tapped the wall lightly. The sound echoed differently there, dull and deep. He ran his fingers along the seam and found a hidden latch. The panel swung inward, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, a small tin box, and an old reel-to-reel tape recorder, its metal dulled but intact. Kellen's breath caught. He carried the items up the steps carefully, as though they might bruise. Otis's hands trembled as he touched the oilcloth. "That's it," he whispered. "The cooperative." Rowan frowned. "What cooperative?" Otis swallowed. "The Juniper Lakeshore Cooperative, founded in 1933. My parents and a handful of others. They pooled land, fishing rights, dock access, kept speculators out when times were desperate." He met Rowan's eyes. They trusted this place to keep the records when banks couldn't. Kellen unwrapped the bundle. Inside were ledgers, maps, handwritten charters bearing signatures and seals. Dates leapt out, 1933, 1935, long before zoning laws could erase intent. Rowan covered her mouth. "This changes everything," she said. Otis nodded. "If it still stands." They played the tape next. The recorder whirred to life with a brittle hum, then a voice emerged, deep and steady, crackling with age. A man spoke of stewardship, of land held in trust for community use, of protections against sale without unanimous consent. Near the end, the voice paused, then added quietly, "If these words are found, it means the lake still needs guardians." Silence followed, thick and reverent. Sable broke it with 3 slow taps of her paw against the floor, measured, calm. Kellen felt it then, unmistakably. Not danger, not warning, but alignment. The pieces he had spent years keeping separate, skill, loss, vigilance, clicked into a single purpose. Rowan looked at him. "You hear it too," she said. He nodded. "This isn't just evidence," he said. "It's responsibility." Outside, the lake shifted, ice murmuring like distant applause. The inn seemed to settle around them, beams creaking not in complaint but acknowledgement. Otis leaned back, exhaustion finally reaching him, but his smile held. "Then it's decided," he said. "We stop running. We stand." Sable lay down beside the open hatch, guarding it without command. Kellen closed the ledger carefully, as if tucking the past back into a safer shape. Above them, the Juniper Lantern Inn held its breath, and for the first time in decades, exhaled. The lake changed color the morning after they found the records. It no longer wore the dull steel gray of winter fatigue, but shifted instead to a deeper blue, darker and clearer, as if something beneath its surface had been rinsed clean. Thin ice stretched across the shallows near the inn, cracked into long, pale seams that caught the light like veins of glass. The air was bitter, sharp enough to sting the lungs, and every sound carried farther than it should have. Kellen stood on the porch with the ledgers stacked carefully behind him on the table, weighted down by a lantern and a coil of rope. He had barely slept, not from fear, but from the kind of alertness that came when purpose finally outran doubt. His beard had grown rough over the past days, dark stubble cutting sharper lines along his jaw, and his eyes looked clearer than Rowan had yet seen them, less burdened, more deliberate. He wore his old insulated jacket, patched at the elbow, the same one he'd worn during winters when survival depended on noticing small things before they became fatal. Rowan joined him with 2 mugs of coffee, steam lifting into the cold. She moved more slowly now, not from weakness, but from thought. Her braid hung loose over one shoulder, auburn strands catching the pale light. Since the cellar, she had grown quieter, but there was a steadiness beneath it, an acceptance that whatever her husband had once known, she would now finish. She handed Kellen a mug without speaking and leaned against the railing, eyes on the ice. Otis sat just inside the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, cane in hand. His color was off this morning, paler. The blue of his eyes washed lighter, but his focus was sharp. He watched the lake the way a farmer watched clouds, reading more than shape. "It's not just paper," he said, breaking the silence. "Paper proves things to courts, but the lake The lake convinces people, Kellen nodded. You said there was something else, he replied. Something the records pointed to. Otis shifted, pain flickering briefly across his face before he smothered it. My mother called it the heart bell, he said, not because it rang loud, but because it reminded folks what they were responsible for. He looked at Rowan. Your husband heard it once, years ago. He came back soaked to the bone and said the lake was keeping watch. Rowan's breath caught, but she didn't look away. Where is it? She asked. Otis's gaze moved north, toward a narrow point of land where the ice thickened sooner than elsewhere. Under the west pier, he said, or what's left of it. They prepared without ceremony. Kellen retrieved the old diving suit from the shed behind the inn, patched and stiff but serviceable. It smelled faintly of oil and salt, and when he ran his hands over it, memory stirred. Different water, different danger, same discipline. Rowan laid out towels and a thermos of hot broth. Otis pressed a small brass key into Kellen's palm, its surface worn smooth. It was never mine, he said, just held. Sable paced near the edge of the porch, restless but controlled. Her silvered muzzle caught the light, age beginning to show in the white dusting along her face, but her body remained powerful, coiled. When Kellen knelt to adjust the seals on the helmet, she pressed her forehead briefly against his chest, a grounding weight. Her eyes were steady, ready. The ice groaned softly as Kellen stepped onto it, careful to distribute his weight, the rope secured around his waist and anchored back at the porch. Rowan held the line, knuckles white but grip firm. Sable moved ahead of him, paws light, stopping at a point where the ice darkened. She lifted one paw and tapped 3 times, slow, deliberate. Here. Kellen knelt and began to chip at the ice, each strike measured. The sound carried across the lake, echoing back from the far shore. When the hole widened enough, he aimed his flashlight downward. The beam cut through the dark water, catching on something metallic wedged between stones. A curve, then another, unmistakable in shape. He didn't hesitate. He lowered himself into the water. Cold biting through the suit like teeth, breath tightening in his chest. The world narrowed to the rhythm of his heart and the cone of light ahead. He reached the object and brushed away silt. A bell, broad and heavy, its surface engraved with twisting vines and the initials JLC, the year 1933 stamped beneath. At its base, a small lock waited. Kellen's fingers found the key. It slid in smoothly, turned with a click that sounded impossibly loud underwater. The bell shuddered. Then it rang. Not sharply, not violently. The sound rolled outward, deep and resonant, vibrating through the water and up through the ice. Above, Sable barked once, sharp and urgent, then went silent, ears pinned forward. Rowan felt the rope hum in her hands. Even Otis, watching from the doorway, straightened as if he had been called by name. Kellen surfaced moments later, gasping, the bell secured against his chest. The sound lingered even after it faded. An echo felt more than heard. As he was hauled back onto the ice, he noticed something strange. The cracks around the hole had softened, edges smoothing, as if the lake itself had eased. They brought the bell inside and set it on the long table beneath the lantern. In the quiet that followed, it seemed to glow, not with light, but with presence. Rowan touched it carefully, reverently. This is proof, she said, not just of ownership, of intent. Otis smiled, exhausted now, but peaceful. It was never meant to scare anyone, he said, just to remind them. That afternoon, the news spread faster than they could control it. By evening, the inn filled again, not with hammers this time, but with people. Neighbors, fishermen, teachers, families. Someone brought soup, someone else brought a fiddle. Lanterns were lit along the porch, their reflections trembling on the ice. They called it Lantern Night, though no one remembered who named it first. Sheriff Maris Greywolf arrived quietly, standing near the back watching the bell with a thoughtful expression. This will matter, she said to Kellen, in court and outside it. He nodded. Then we're ready. Sable lay near the table, head on her paws, eyes following the shifting reflections. When Kellen struck the bell gently once more, its tone rolled across the lake. From somewhere far out, a loon answered, its call long and mournful, then another. The sound braided with the bell's echo until the cold itself seemed to listen. Otis closed his eyes, his breathing shallow but even. Rowan stood beside him. one hand resting on his shoulder, the other gripping the ledger. Kellen looked around the room. The light, the people, the bell that had waited decades to be heard, and understood that the fight ahead would be loud, bureaucratic, exhausting. But this chapter was complete. The lake had spoken, and they had answered. The county courthouse in Silver Bay was not an impressive building. It squatted near the harbor like a retired dock worker, square, practical, uninterested in beauty. Its stone walls bore the marks of long winters, and the steps leading inside were chipped smooth by decades of boots carrying arguments, petitions, and quiet hope. On the morning of the hearing, the sky hung low and pale, and Lake Superior beyond the town lay calm in a way that felt deliberate, as if it had decided to observe. Kellen arrived early. He wore a clean flannel shirt under his jacket, his beard trimmed but still rough enough to remind anyone looking that polish was not his language. He carried a weathered satchel over one shoulder, heavier than it looked. Inside were the ledgers, copies of the charters, and photographs of the Heart Bell lifted from beneath the ice. The weight was familiar, not just paper, responsibility. Sable walked beside him, leash slack, her head level with his knee, eyes alert but untroubled. She had aged in small ways over the years, silver along her muzzle, a stiffness that showed only when she first stood, but today her gait was smooth, purposeful. This was work, she understood. Rowan followed a few steps behind, dressed simply in a dark coat, her auburn hair pulled back neatly. The grief she carried no longer bent her posture. Instead, it sharpened her focus. She held Otis's old brass key in her pocket, thumb resting against it like a worry stone. Otis himself had stayed at the inn, too weak now to travel, but he had insisted they take his words with them. "Let the place speak," he had said. "It knows how." Inside the courtroom, the air smelled faintly of dust and coffee. Wooden benches creaked as people settled, locals, reporters from Duluth, a few men in suits who looked uncomfortable without control of the room. At the front sat Hollis Crane, immaculate as ever, his navy suit pressed sharp enough to cut. His beard was trimmed closer today, his expression composed, but the confidence he wore now was brittle rather than smooth. He nodded once at Kellen, a professional courtesy stripped of warmth. Beside Hollis sat a woman Kellen had not seen before. She was in her early 40s, with sleek black hair cut precisely at the jaw and glasses that reflected the room like mirrors. Her name was Marilyn Hodge, Blue Silt's senior counsel. She moved with minimal gestures, conserving energy, her expression unreadable. This was not her first contested land case. She had built her career arguing that progress had the right of way. Sheriff Maris Greywolf stood near the aisle, arms folded, her uniform crisp. She met Kellen's eyes and gave a small nod. Behind her, Paul Jensen, the mechanic, sat stiffly in a borrowed jacket, hat in his hands. Eli Boone was there too, beard combed, eyes fixed forward. The inn had sent its witnesses. Judge Ellen Cartwright entered without ceremony. She was in her 60s, her hair pulled into a practical bun, her face lined with the kind of wear that came from listening more than speaking. She took her seat, scanned the room once, and nodded for proceedings to begin. Marilyn Hodge rose first. Her voice was calm, efficient. She spoke of infrastructure needs, renewable targets, and zoning flexibility. She described the Juniper Lantern Inn as a privately held structure occupying land of strategic importance, her language precise enough to drain color from the room. "While we respect local history," she said, "history cannot impede lawful development that benefits the broader region." When it was their turn, Rowan stood. Her voice was steady, not loud. She spoke of the inn not as a business, but as a place that had fed people during strikes, sheltered families during storms, and hosted meetings when banks had failed. Then Kellen stepped forward and placed the ledgers on the table. "These," he said, "are records of the Juniper Lakeshore Cooperative, founded in 1933. He did not embellish. He did not plead. He let the dates, signatures, and seals speak. Copies were passed to the judge. A murmur moved through the benches. Maris followed, presenting photographs of the attempted arson, the fuel analysis, the timing of survey vehicles. "This wasn't coincidence," she said. "It was pressure." Marilyn objected, but the judge held up a hand. "I'll allow it," she said. "Intent matters." Then came the bell. Kellen carried it forward with care, setting it on the clerk's table. In the daylight streaming through tall windows, its surface glowed softly, the engraved vines catching the light. Judge Cartwright leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. JLC, she read, 1933. Yes, Rowan said, the cooperative's mark. Hollis Crane shifted in his seat. Judge Cartwright looked at Kellen. May I hear it? Kellen nodded. He lifted the striker and rang the bell once. The sound was not loud. It did not echo sharply. Instead, it rolled outward, deep and even, filling the room in a way that made conversation feel rude. For a moment, no one spoke. Some later said they felt it in their chests. Others said it was only acoustics. Judge Cartwright waited until the sound faded completely before speaking. The court finds, she said, that the Juniper Lakeshore Cooperative was lawfully established and has not been dissolved. She looked directly at Hollis and Marilyn. The land in question is held in community trust. Any development proposal must respect that trust. Her gavel struck once. Petition denied. The room exhaled. Outside, word spread faster than paperwork ever could. By evening, people gathered at the inn again, this time not in fear or urgency, but in celebration, restrained by reverence. Lanterns were hung along the porch, their light trembling across the ice. Someone brought a guitar, someone else brought stew. The bell was placed on its stand beneath the lantern, polished, present. Otis sat by the window, wrapped in blankets, his breathing shallow but peaceful. When Kellen told him the verdict, the old man smiled, eyes closing briefly. Good, he murmured. Then it worked. Later that night, when the crowd had thinned and the lake lay quiet under stars, Kellen sat on the porch steps with Sable leaning against his leg. Rowan joined him, handing over a mug of tea. So, she said, what now? Kellen watched the lantern sway, the reflections breaking and reforming on the ice. He thought of roads he had driven without knowing why, of skills learned for destruction now turned to keeping something intact. Now, he said, we keep listening. Inside, the bell shifted slightly as a breeze passed through the open door. It chimed once, softly. From far out on the lake, a loon answered. Sable lifted her head and tapped the wooden step 3 times, slow, content. The Juniper Lantern Inn stood not as a relic but as a promise kept. And maybe the miracle was never the bell, or the lake, or the old tavern that refused to burn. Maybe the miracle was quieter than that. Maybe it was the way God whispers instead of shouts. Through a loyal dog who listens when humans cannot. Through a weary man who chooses to protect instead of walk away. Through ordinary people who stand up, not because it's easy, but because it's right. In our own lives, miracles don't always look like lightning or answered prayers overnight. Sometimes they look like second chances, like staying when leaving would hurt less, like kindness offered when no one is watching, like faith that shows up quietly and waits to be used. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may be losing hope. Leave a comment below and tell us what faith means to you, or where you've seen a quiet miracle in your own life. And if you believe no one, no child, no animal, no soul should ever face fear alone, please subscribe to this channel for more stories of hope, grace, and redemption. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. Wherever you are watching from, may His light find you in the ordinary moments, and may you never underestimate the power of quiet miracles.